Okay, so now for chapter two, with now some understanding from chapter one about what economics is. That's the science of scarcity and this understanding that decisions are made on the margins, comparing marginal benefits with marginal costs. What we do in chapter two is we try to understand kind of the world around us. And we revisit the idea of those three major economic questions. What's going to be produced? How is it going to be produced? Who's it going to be produced for? And we try to understand those questions as being answered in a global framework, right? So that countries are making these decisions based on what they feel they need and based on what other countries are doing. Okay. So, as I said, I'm not going to generally spend too much time on these picture slides, but I will spend a little bit of time on this. Um, the Dreamliner, the Boeing airplane, that is our largest exported good. Largest not only probably in terms of size, but also just in terms of dollar value. Boeing is our the largest export good that we produce for the rest of the world. And if we think about countries that produce airplanes, passenger airplanes, there's really only two groups, the Europeans with Airbus and the United States. Canada makes slightly smaller planes, um, the Bombardier group, but for the most part, Boeing is our large producer of airplanes. Now, why is that the case, right? Why is it that almost no shoes are produced in the United States, yet all airplanes are either produced in the United States or Europe and not anywhere else in the world? That's kind of part of the thing that we can try to understand here in this chapter. Okay, so as I said, again, we're going to be looking at those three major economic questions. What's produced, how is it produced, who is it produced for? And we're going to look at those questions in terms of what's done in the United States versus what's done around the world, and then try to understand this in terms of a circular flow model, what's all being done around the world. Okay, so of everything that's produced, we basically have to decide between two time frames. Basically, we could decide to consume something now, or we could decide to consume something later. When we decide to consume something later, economists call this basically a capital good. Capital goods represents buildings and machines. Buildings and machines represent capital goods that are used by um, a business to produce other goods. Buildings and machines are the capital goods. And then we've got consumption goods that you and I would all purchase, right? Like if I buy a bag of donuts, right now I'm eating some Hostess donuts, right? That was a consumption good. You right now are listening to this class. You are engaged in a consumption service, right? Of education services being delivered to you. These are the three major categories of the things that exist that are being produced. Capital goods, or sorry, consumption goods, consumption services, and capital goods. We make a decision both in the United States and in all countries of the world about how these things will be used. Okay, now, I've already kind of described this here, so now we get a full slide where they talk about it as if, I don't know, I guess as if I didn't know anything about it and didn't wasn't able to talk about it. So again, we have our consumption goods and services. These are the things that are being used and enjoyed personally and at the present moment. And then we've got the capital goods, generally bought by businesses, but they could also be consumed. They could also be purchased by individuals. We could think of like a household, buying a house, that's a capital good. But it's used to increase your productive resources. And so those are our capital goods. How do we produce things? Well, we have four categories of inputs that we can use to produce those outputs. So the outputs again are our consumption goods, our consumption services, our capital goods. But then we break this into four categories: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Let's start with the first one, land. So land is not just the physical land, but it's also everything above the land and below the land. So we could think of this as things like clean air, clean water, oil being under the ground, natural gas being under the ground, any number of things here that are just natural resources. We call them gifts of nature, or I guess as a Catholic we'd call them gifts from God, or something along those lines, right? Use whatever terminology you want, as long as you understand it's something that's just there, something nature. Then we have our labor. Now, this is the labor. So we have land, labor. Labor consists of two things. It's not only the people, the number of people that we have, but it's the quality of the person that we have. What do I mean by this, right? Um, we can imagine that um, a state may have, let's say, um, 1 million people. Okay, so it's got 1 million people. Now, how do I count how many workers I have? Do I count all 1 million as potentially able to work? And do I then compare that to, let's say, a neighboring state that's also got 1 million people, so we can consider them being the same? Not really. Because what's also important is the education level of those people, what economists would call human capital. Now, it turns out that this economist right here, Scheiding, I've done quite a bit of research on this almost over 20 years ago on human capital. It was actually a really cool project I did. Um, grant me a moment here just to talk about some of the work I've done in this area. So think of the frontier, right? Like 1700s, 1800s, and you're going west, right? And you're like wagon, and you got like an ox pulling your wagon along, and you arrive on some farmland, and you say, like, dude, I'm gonna settle here, right? And you start plowing the land, and you live there for a few years. After living there a few years, you get to start to know things, right? Like you're gonna get to know, like, wow, the water from this river really helps these plants grow. And these kinds of plants grow best on this plot of land. These plants grow best on this plot of land. And, when you got to buy seeds, don't buy them from Mr. Baker because he'll cheat you, right? Like you buy them from Mr. Jones. And, when you've got all your crops and you've got it all harvested, don't sell it to, Mrs. Stevens, get it to Carl, right? You're right. So you can imagine that there's this very kind of specific knowledge that you can only capture by having lived there. And so what my research showed was that early settlers to a plot of land actually had additional valuable human capital that they could use to do things. What does that mean for what we're talking about here? Is that an earlier settler to a plot of land versus a later settler to a plot of land? They are not the same worker. That the earlier settler to that plot of land is more valuable than the one who arrived later. Now, fast forward to today. Why are you going to school? Why are you going to college? Right? It's because you were kept being told you'll earn more wages and you'll have a more secure job and things will be better. That's generally the case. That's generally what economists believe to be the case. And why we believe that to be the case is because workers who are more skilled, who have this human capital, are more productive and they get paid more. So a more highly qualified worker counts more, counts as more than a worker who is less educated. Then we've got our capital. So we've got land, labor, and capital. As I wrote down previously, capital is basically machines, buildings, anything that's being used to produce other goods and services. Um, Capital, as I do want to emphasize, because this is a common mistake, capital is not money, stocks, bonds, think, things that you might think of as, um, uh, capital in a more modern sense. Um, we see this kind of description of capital even in the writings of like Adam Smith, and you see it in the writings of Karl Marx, whose book is called Das Kapital, right? Capital. But again, they're talking about instruments, machines, buildings, things used to produce other things. Okay. So imagine a country then, or a society that has a certain amount of land, a certain amount of labor, a certain amount of capital, and then finally, a certain amount of entrepreneurial spirit. Now, what do we mean by this? We mean, does that society encourage individuals to take risks, to build new kinds of businesses, to develop new goods and services? We could certainly say that that's the case in the United States, where individuals like go on shows like Shark's Tank and whatnot, where we kind of make as into heroes the individual who is an entrepreneur. We can imagine other societies, though, um, where being entrepreneurial is not even an option, right? Um, Maybe more centrally planned economies. Just as a very extreme example, we can't imagine an entrepreneur existing in North Korea just based on the structure of that economy. But now what I want you to do is kind of picture this as almost kind of like um, I don't know, like a mixing bowl or like we're cooking here. So the ingredients are the land, the labor, the capital, and entrepreneurship, and we're mixing it all together and we're producing output goods. Now, it's helping us determine what is being produced. Now, here's the second part to it. Who are we producing it for? Who we're producing it for comes down to um, the income that's earned, right? Because you can't pay for something if you don't have any income to pay for it. So where does income come from? What are the sources of income? Well, the one that you and I all are probably well aware of, and I'm just going to jump to that one part of it, are wages, right? You and I, unless you're very, very rich and you haven't told me about it, although why would you? Um, right? We all have to work for a living. So wages is our primary source of income. Now, right? I mean, I could be a person who owns a few houses or own an apartment complex. Then my income would come from, um, it'd be a combination of two things. It'd be both rent as well as interest, right? Because the interest is if I own the apartment building, right, I'm being paid, compensated for that. So interest, that's the income I get for letting others use my capital. Rent, that's the income I get for letting others um, using my land. And then finally, we know that an entrepreneur, they make money based on their idea being good and them earning a profit, or their idea being bad and them earning a loss. So those four different factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, all have four different sources of income: rent, wages, interest, and profit. Now, I'm just going to jump over these, not that you need to care here. That you could think of this as how is that income distributed, right? That most of us are workers, right? Most of this is wages. But what that does is it gets us to um, this final question, right? Um, is how is that income distributed? And certainly what we can see here is that, and again, as I say this, you don't need to care what I believe, and you shouldn't feel influenced by what I'm going to state here. But I look around, even just the community that I live in and whatnot, and there is inequality, right? There are certainly in Hawaii, we have homeless people. It's easy. It's easier to be homeless because the weather's always great, right, outside. And yet we have other people that have incredibly large houses, right, and multiple nice-looking vehicles, right? And then we've got others who can't afford a vehicle. We live in an unequal society. Now, we can kind of see that here, right? That the top 20% of that 20% of the population own over 50%, capture over 50% of the income. I'm not passing any judgment here. I'm just saying that's the way that it is. In some sense, it's a reflection of the capitalist society that we live in. We should want to have people who take great risks, have large amounts of education, who work hard to earn more money. I mean, I'm not opposed to that. But what we also know, and I guess what bothers me more personally, and again, doesn't have to bother you, but it's this fact that in, you can get stuck being poor. And you can continue to be rich even if you're really dumb or don't work hard because you've got all these resources. So it's kind of like a legacy, right? It's that it's kind of like the luck of the draw, right? When you're born, you don't get to pick the family you're born into. And you could imagine that, right? You could be born into a poor family, be a good person, and dude, you're more likely than not going to also be poor, despite being a good person and working hard because you were born into a poor family. It's difficult. I mean, we attach ourselves to this myth of being able to pull yourself up from your bootstraps and rise, capture rises in income. But it's difficult. It's incredibly difficult. And it requires a fair amount of hard work and luck. Um, what some people oppose here is then the attempts to fix this problem. Well, some would debate whether we need to fix it or not. And then when you do try to fix it, we generally have to use the tax code, which some people oppose, right? That you take some of the income from the very rich and you reallocate it to the very poor. And some people take offense to that. Dude, there's nothing that bothers me more than old data. I think this number is about 340 million right now. So let's see here. I think it's about 340, 331 as of 2021. The world population being 7 billion people, with over a billion of those in China, a billion of those in India, one person being born in the United States every 12 seconds, and in the world, 30 people being born every 12 seconds. Seems like a lot. 7.888 billion. But yeah, we're growing. Is that bad? Not necessarily. I mean, some people long ago worried that we'd run out of resources to feed all those people, but it turns out we became better farmers and better able to grow the things that are needed. Now, in the global economy, um, we can separate out things into countries that are advanced versus countries that are not advanced. So basically, we have rich and poor countries. And about a billion of these almost 8 million people, or about 15% of the world's population, live in rich countries. That's not our issue. That's not our concern, right? We don't worry too much about the billion people living in rich countries. We care more about the fact that everyone else lives in emerging or developing economies. And this represents most of the world. 155 of the 180, 190 some countries that exist in the world. Central and Eastern Europe, most of Asia, all of Africa, most of the Middle East, most of Central and South America live at a level of poverty that it would be difficult for us to even fathom, even on, at least from the United States level. That being poor in the United States sucks, but it really, really sucks in these other countries in the world. I mean, I've seen parts of it. I mean, I'm sure you can go on the internet and I'm sure there's pictures and videos and stuff like that of what are the problems that plague these developing and emerging market economies. It turns out that trying to grow an economy is very difficult. And it's natural to kind of think about it. Why is that the case? Why are these countries so poor? I mean, my son, my oldest son, who's 9 years old, asked me this question. Um, Monday or earlier this week. So just a few days ago. He's in third grade. He's taking this class, not this class, but he's taking a class where they're talking about societies and economies and entrepreneurship. And he asked me, because he knows I'm an economist, why is it that countries are poor? My response to him as a 9-year-old was that it comes down to um, two things. In my opinion, it comes down to two things. It really comes down to one thing. One, you need a society that is stable, that has a rule of law that's followed, and where the level of corruption is at least low, or at least it's known. um, we have corruption in the United States. We certainly do. Um, I, I'm in a union, and I certainly get the sense sometimes that secret deals and whatnot, that there's a level of corruption that exists within my union and the dealings that it has with the state. But we kind of know it, right? To say that that there's suspect dealings in a union is like saying it's stating an obvious fact. It's the way that it always has been. But you kind of know that that's the case in the United States. Um, so you need there to be some stability. You need there to be a rule of law that dominates. But then the question would be is why do you need that? And that gets really down to the one big thing you need to help an economy grow. And that is that you need capital. You need capital. You need capital. And the only way you can get capital, well, the only two ways you can get capital is if either your people, the people in your country, save a lot of money. And for them to save a lot of money, that then means that they need to reduce their consumption to be able to save. And then that savings is put in a bank that's then lent out to businesses that then buy buildings and machines to help them produce more stuff. Or the country needs to capture savings from other countries to help them grow. Um, Agree or disagree with the motivation of why they're doing it. But China has invested a great deal of money in Africa. Africa, which is a continent that contains lots of countries that are developing. And so then you would ask yourself, why does China care about Africa? Well, they certainly want the resources that Africa has. They want the consumers that exist in Africa. And they want those countries to diplomatically recognize that Taiwan is part of China and not an independent country. You put that all together, and if you're a developing economy, you're like, "Huh, I really want to grow. My people in my country can't afford to save money. Here come, it's not just the Chinese, other countries do things like that, right? The United States does it, right, to ensure that, they can use certain plots of land or access to sea, and then they'll lend a lot of money to that country to be able to do that thing. So I'm not trying to pick on China here, but right, let's say that you're the president of um, um, Cameroon. You might be willing to accept the money from the Chinese because it's a path for you to grow. And all you got to do is just say, yeah, sure, Taiwan's part of China. Well, it doesn't matter to me. I'm all the way in Cameroon. Um, but it's difficult. And you got to hope for a lot of luck. Because then, even once you get the money from another country that they invest in you, they're going to want to get paid back. And if the economy turns down even a little bit, you're not going to be able to pay that back, which is exactly what ended up happening to the Chinese investments in Africa, is that COVID happened. And then all of a sudden China found out, dude, these countries don't have any money to be able to pay back things, pay back the money that they borrowed. Okay. So there we go. There's a fancy little picture of what the global economy looks like, with the United States representing about 15% of the total global income. Okay, so what is it when we look at these countries globally? What kind of differences do we see? Well, the one thing we see is that in advanced countries like the United States, we don't focus on the production of simple goods. We don't focus on the production of food. Instead, what we focus on in the United States is the production of quite complex goods. With the exception of things like semiconductors, which, now we're trying to produce that. Instead, most semiconductors are made in Taiwan, actually. But in developing economies, again, the focus is on like textiles, footwear, what is this, sports gear, toys, electronics, furniture, steel. Right? It's just kind of the dirty work of producing goods. You don't need a lot of education. You might not even need a lot of capital to produce these things. And so, these countries are the the emerging economies are just struggling to survive. That's all they're trying to do. Now, um, essentially, what this slide is just saying, though, here is that um, that services are slowly becoming a much larger portion of what economies are producing, as opposed to actually physically manufacturing goods. And one of the biggest differences that we see among countries that are advanced versus developing is the level of human capital, the level of training. In a, let's go back to this issue. Why are poor countries so poor? Again, lack of capital, but then there's the second thing that makes a country poor. And I'm not trying to be controversial when I say this, I'm just stating the facts as they are here. So don't think I am preaching to you or talking about something I don't know. But um, in Africa, on the continent of Africa, one of the poorest countries in Africa about 20 years ago was Ethiopia. And Ethiopia had long periods of famine, no capital, um, underdeveloped banking system, corruption. Things were bad. And on top of that, as bad as things were in Ethiopia, things were worse because you had an entire segment of the population that had almost no human capital. Women. Very few women had human capital in Ethiopia because they were getting pregnant so early. And that created a problem. Then not only do you have women not getting education that they need to be productive in the workforce, but then also your population is growing in an uncontrolled fashion. And you have to supply stuff to all these workers, right? To all these new people growing in your economy. Today, 2023, Ethiopia is no longer one of the poorest countries in Africa. And all that they did, well, they did a number of things, but one of the simple things that they did was that they empowered women to do family planning, right? To decide when they were going to be ready to have children and know that they could have educational opportunities that they could pursue instead of just having children. And there's a really interesting article. I've been meaning to read it. It just came out this year. I don't remember. It just came out. Yeah, right here. And anyone can freely read this, so this is free to read the entire article. I haven't read it yet, but it's basically an article talking about how family planning in Ethiopia has helped that country grow so dramatically. It's a really interesting article. And it makes you think about things. We talk about things obviously in society, um, and we think of it as controversial for different reasons, right? Like things like, well, family planning and you a woman's right to choose and things like that. Um, but we can also make some connections to economic growth. And we see part of that right here, at least in the example of Ethiopia. Another thing that makes countries poor, and this was the China, um, this is the argument that the Chinese made about why they needed to invest in Africa, was that countries in Africa, the continent of Africa, were poor because they had a lack of a transportation system. So if they have no way to bring goods inside the country, right, they come by ocean, they're shipped, and then there's no way to bring them to the inside of the country, that's going to make that country poor. So again, what China was investing in was called the Belt Road. This is what China was investing in. I mean, look at this map here. I'm not sure if this site has the map. It's a really cool looking map. It doesn't show it. Okay, I'm going to click on images. Something could be oh, here. Why don't I just click on this? I mean, look at what the Chinese plan was. I'm just going to pick this one here. I don't know. Is this a reputable website that I'm looking at or not? It is the Brookings Institute. I mean, look at what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to be rail and it was supposed to be roads. And so here it's going to, from China where goods are being produced, to other countries in Asia, to Russia, to Rotterdam, which is the global shipping hub of the world, one of the largest shipping ports in the world, then over to Nairobi, which then gets you through Africa, right? And you can look at then their investments within Africa here of building roads. Pretty cool stuff. So you got some good economists in China is what you're seeing here. They're actually taking, I'm not going to say they're taking my advice, but they're taking the advice of economists and putting it into action here. Okay, so now let's look at how those goods and services are distributed around the world. It's mostly to the United States. We use a lot of, we consume a lot of stuff here in the, in the United States. And in other countries where there's less money, there's less consumption. So we put that all together into what's called a circular flow model. And what the circular flow model does is it links what's being earned to what's being spent. Basically, households and firms have income flows coming in, and they use that income to buy other things. So you got your households and firms that then interact with each other in the marketplace setting. So think about it this way, right? When you got your job, wherever you're working, what you essentially did is you told that employer, I'm going to sell to you my labor services. I am going to receive income, and then I'm going to use that income, and maybe I'll buy it from you, the employer, but maybe I'll just buy it from other businesses, right? In the goods market. So the income that I receive in the factors market, I spend in the goods market. For the business, right? They're earning their income in the goods market and they're spending their money in the factors market to be able to produce those goods and services. And that's what you see here, right? That's where you then start to get the circular flow model. These are the two markets, the factors market and the goods market. And these are the two sites where the households and the businesses interact with each other, where households are selling their land, their labor, their capital, their entrepreneurship to businesses, right? And the firms are hiring them. And then firms are using that to produce goods that are then sold to people. Let's not worry about this slide. It's not that important here for what's going on here. This is just capturing now our flows of income. So in return for selling my labor, I am paid a wage. In return for getting that product from the goods market, I have to pay for it. Now, the government has a role in all of this as well, and that cannot be denied. And we can agree or disagree about how limited or how expansive the government should be. It doesn't matter what you believe. The government has a role. Certainly the government buys goods and services. They've obviously, right, they're paying my wage, right? State government is paying my wage right now to deliver this service to you. Um, so, right, and I'm getting paid both from your tuition income, but also from money from the legislature, right? Because your income, the tuition payments don't cover the entire cost of going to college. So that means then governments, state governments, local governments, federal governments also buy goods and services. And they also hire workers, buy land and whatnot. Now, the way that they finance their activities is through taxes, personal taxes, corporate taxes, social security taxes. All these taxes they need to collect to be able to spend it on the other things. So if we add that then to the circular flow model, we get something like this, where the government kind of exists in the middle, both collecting taxes from households and businesses, but then also transferring money to them. Why do we say transfers? Well, like if I get a Social Security payment, I'm just getting that payment because I'm old, right? So that's a transfer from the government to me, the old person. Businesses also get money from the government, right? We certainly saw that during COVID with things like PPP and things like that, where the government just gave money to businesses to stay in business. But then also too, what we're saying here is that the government buys goods and services in the goods market. And then we can complicate the circular flow model one additional way. And that additional way we can complicate it is if we make the circular flow model global. What if other countries can buy goods and services and buy factors of production? Now, there are two ways this can go. We can import goods. Oh, geez, this looks dated. iPod, no one uses iPods anymore, right? It's all about iPhone. You can't even buy an iPod, I don't think. Um, Wii games, Nike shoes. These are all imports. So we buy these and they're produced in other countries. Then we also sell things, right? And that was our very first picture of Boeing selling those airplanes to other countries. That would be an export. So we have imports, that's what we buy from the rest of the world. Then we've got exports, that's what we sell to the rest of the world. Well, not only are we buying goods and services from the rest of the world, but we also need to, we also are investing money in other countries in the world, and other countries are investing money in us, right? China buys a lot of US government debt. We in the United States have a lot of capital that we use to buy stocks in foreign companies and bonds. All that international finance is also part of the exchange of goods in the countries. And so that's what we see here. So if we alter this circular flow model a little bit, we could look at it as here's the US, here's the rest of the world. We have goods with imports and exports, and then we're also financing that in the financial markets. And we see this here. Exports, that's what we get money as other goods are sold to the rest of the world. And then for the imports, where we're buying those goods from the rest of the world, we have to pay for them. And we see that then, right, the flows of the payment are then in the financial market side, where we either borrow money or we lend money to other countries in the world. Okay, we don't need to worry about this. And the planes come from a lot of places. Okay, that's it for this chapter, chapter 2.